I heard it before I saw the guard move, and I have thought about that order of things every day since. First the sound, a thin, ragged crying that came up out of the ground itself, out of the iron grate at the edge of the carriage road, no bigger than a thread of noise and somehow louder than the whole forecourt. Then the man behind the bearskin turned his head. I sell flowers at the corner of the west forecourt of Harrowmere, where the great gates open onto the cobbled apron the carriages cross, and I have done it for 19 years, which means I have watched the sentries on the mews post stand their watches in every weather the sky owns. I know the look of a man who does not move. I have built a small living on the fact that tourists will pay 3 coins for a posy, because they have just watched something they cannot quite believe. A man in a scarlet tunic and a tall black bearskin standing so still that children dare each other to make him blink. In 19 years, I had never once seen one of them turn his head for anything smaller than a king. So when this one did, I set down my buckets. It was a bright, hard morning in the early spring, the cobbles still dark with the night's rain, and the forecourt was filling the way it does an hour before a procession. The rope lines going up, the crowd thickening 4 and 5 deep along them, phones lifting like a field of little glass leaves. A line of carriages would come through within the hour. You could feel the press of it building. Stewards in dark coats walked the apron checking the road was clear. Everything was aimed at the gates, at the gold and the ceremony about to come down the road. And down at the foot of the gatepost, where nobody was looking, something tiny was dying in the dark. The crying came again, weaker. I saw the guard's eyes go to the grate, only his eyes, the rest of him carved, and I followed them, and that was when I understood. The storm drain. The iron grating at the lip of the carriage road, set there to take the rain off the apron, its bars wide enough to swallow a man's fist. The night's downpour had filled the channel under it. You could hear the water still running below, a low cold rushing. And caught on something just inside the mouth of that drain, half in the running water, was a scrap of wet gray fur no larger than my 2 thumbs. A kitten, 3 weeks old, perhaps 4. It had gone in after the warmth of the dark, or been carried in by the rain, and now the water had risen around it and the current was pulling at it, and it had wedged itself against the bars with the last of what it had. And it was crying because crying was the only thing left it knew how to do. I want to be honest about what the rest of us did, because it matters to the kind of man I am about to describe. We did nothing. A whole forecourt of decent people, hundreds of us, and we did nothing, because the kitten was small and the procession was large and our eyes had been trained all morning to look at the gates. A woman near me heard it and frowned and looked about for the source, and then a steward called the rope line straight and she turned back to the gates. A boy pointed and his father said, "Leave it," and that was a kindness in its way. "Leave it. Don't lean over the carriage road. The carriages are coming." Everyone had a reason. The crying was somebody else's to answer, and so it was nobody's. The guard had a reason too. He had the best reason in the kingdom. He was on his post. You have to understand what that means, because I did not fully, not until that morning. The sentry on the mews post is not a decoration, whatever the tourists think. He is the visible edge of a working thing, the carriage road, the gate drill, the timing of a procession that has 100 moving parts and no room for one of them to be late. He had a relief due, a sequence to keep, an officer somewhere who would answer for him. The whole weight of the ceremony about to roll down that road rested, in some small part, on him being exactly where he was, doing exactly nothing, until he was told otherwise. A man does not walk off the mews post because something is crying. A man does not walk off the mews post for anything. That is the entire point of him. I saw him not move, and I saw what it cost. I was close enough, 20 feet, no more, to watch his face do the thing a disciplined face does when it is fighting itself and losing very slowly. Nothing dramatic. A man across the road would have seen a statue. But I sell flowers to people who have just watched these men, and I have learned to read the small country of a guardsman's face, and I will tell you what I saw. I saw his jaw set harder. I saw his eyes go back to the front, to the dead middle distance they are trained to hold, and stay there for the space of 3 of the kitten's cries, deliberately, the way a man holds his breath underwater. He was doing his duty. He was being the thing he was put there to be. And the crying came again, and got weaker again, and I watched his eyes break from the front and go down to the grate a second time, and this time they did not come back up. There is a thing that happens to a sound when it is about to stop. It gets thinner. The kitten's cry had been ragged, and now it was only a thread, and the thread was fraying, and any person who has ever sat up with something small and sick knows that sound and knows what comes after it. I knew. I think the whole front rank knew, in the wordless way a crowd knows things, and we all stood there knowing it and looking at the gold gates, and the guard on the mews post stood there knowing it too, with his rifle at his shoulder and 40 generations of discipline holding him in place. And then a steward, hurrying the rope line, walked straight across the mouth of the drain without hearing a thing, his boot coming down on the iron grate, and the kitten screamed, a real scream. The small body's whole self poured into it, and I saw the guard's white glove tighten on the rifle until the leather creaked, and I thought, he is going to hold. God help him, he is going to hold, because that is what he is, and the little thing is going to die 6 feet from 500 people, because every single one of us has a reason. I was wrong about him. I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong. He came off the post. I did not see him decide it. I have gone over it 100 times and I cannot find the moment of the decision, and I have come to think there wasn't one, that the decision had already been made somewhere below where a man decides things and was only waiting for his discipline to get out of its way. One instant he was the statue on the mews post, the fixed point the whole morning turned around. The next he had broken, the rifle coming down off his shoulder in a single clean motion, his boots ringing on the cobbles, 3 long strides that carried him off his mark and across the apron toward the carriage road, toward the grate, toward the thread of crying that was almost not a sound anymore. A gasp went up from the rope line like a wave drawing back. A guard had moved. A guard had left his post. In the whole of my 19 years on that corner I had never seen it, and I have never seen it since. And for one suspended second, the entire forecourt forgot the gates and the gold and the procession, and turned, as one animal, to watch the impossible thing. He reached the drain and went down on one knee on the wet iron. The bearskin came off first. He swept it from his head with his left hand and set it down on the cobbles beside him without looking, the way you set down something you have carried so long it is part of your arm, and underneath it he was just a man, a young man, 25 or so, with cropped fair hair flattened by the cap and a hard plain face gone suddenly soft with concentration. I had never seen one of their faces without the bearskin over it before. None of us had. The crowd made a sound I cannot describe, a kind of indrawn O, because the statue had a head, and the head had a face, and the face was frightened, not for himself, for the small thing in the dark. He laid the rifle flat on the cobbles. He pulled off the white gloves with his teeth, one and then the other, and dropped them, and his bare hands went to the iron grating. It would not lift. I saw the muscle stand out along his forearms, saw him set his whole back into it, and the grate did not move. It was old and rusted into its seat and bolted at the corners, made to take the wheel of a carriage, never made to come up for anyone. He felt along the edge of it fast, the way a man feels for the thing that has gone wrong, and found the bolts, and I watched him understand in half a second that he was not going to lift it, and that there was no time to find a tool that would. The crying had stopped. That was the worst part. While he wrestled the grate, the crying had stopped, and you could see him hear the silence, and you could see what it did to him. "It's gone under," a woman beside me whispered and put her hand over her mouth. It had not gone under. It had only gone quiet, the way the very small go quiet when they have nothing left to spend on noise. But he could not know that, and he did not wait to find out. He flattened himself on the wet iron, a king's guard, in the scarlet tunic with the brass buttons and the metal ribbons, lying full length on a storm drain in front of the gates of Harrowmere, and he put his bare arm down through the bars into the dark, and the running water up to his shoulder, and he reached. I will tell you exactly what that took, because I do not think the people watching their phone screens understood it. The bars were wide enough for an arm and not much more. The water under there was snowmelt and last night's rain, the kind of cold that stops a hand from closing after a minute. He could not see what he was reaching for. He was feeling, blind in a freezing current, for something the size of a small apple that did not want to be touched, while the clock that governs a procession ran on somewhere above him, and an officer of the household came striding across the apron with his face like a slammed door. "Sentry," the officer's voice cut across the forecourt. "Sentry, return to your post." The guard did not look up. His cheek was against the iron, his arm in the drain to the shoulder, his eyes shut so that all of him could pour down into the hand under the water. I have wondered since whether he even heard it. I think he heard it. I think he heard it and made the same choice he had already made once that morning, the choice that has no moment you can point to, and kept reaching. "Sentry," the officer reached him, stood over him. He was a captain, I learned later Captain Vance of the household, a fair man as it turned out, but in that instant a man watching a procession he was answerable for slide toward chaos because one of his sentries was lying on the ground with his hat off. "On your feet. Whatever it is not worth your post." And the young man on the ground said the only words I heard him speak in the whole of it. He said them quietly, not as a defiance, almost as an apology, his eyes still shut and his arms still down in the cold. "It's alive, sir, I can feel it." I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count. "It's alive, sir, I can feel it. Not it's only a kitten, not give me a moment." Just the one fact that had decided everything, offered up to his captain plain, as if to say, "You and I both know the rule, and you and I both know there is a thing under here that is alive, and I am the only one whose arm will reach, so I am sorry, but you will have to do with me what you do with men who break, because I am not taking my arm out of this water until it comes out with the small thing in it." The captain stood over him with his jaw working. And the captain, I watched this, I will swear to it anywhere. The captain looked at the bars and the black water and the bare arm, and looked at the crowd that had gone utterly silent, hundreds of faces. Every phone turned now not on the gates but on the man on the ground, and something went through him. He was an officer with a procession to save and a regulation behind him as old as the kingdom, and he had every right and every reason to haul the boy up by the collar and call the relief and have him off the post and on a charge by noon. He did none of it. He looked once more at the captured ranks of people watching, and then Captain Vance of the household did a thing I have never forgotten. He turned to the steward who had run up behind him and said, low and fast, "Hold the carriages at the inner gate. 2 minutes." And then he knelt down on the wet cobbles beside his own sentry in his good uniform and put his hand on the young man's shoulder, not to pull him off, to brace him. "Steady," the captain said. "I've got your back, reach." That is the moment the forecourt broke open. Not into noise, into something better than noise. A held breath, 500 strong. I felt the woman beside me grip my sleeve. Somewhere a small child said, loud in the silence, "Is he saving the cat?" And nobody shushed it, and the father who had said leave it now lifted the boy onto his shoulder so he could see, and his own eyes were wet. Down in the dark, the bare hand was searching. I could see it in the young man's face, every inch of the search. The moment his fingertips brushed something and lost it, the flinch as the cold finally reached his shoulder and tried to take his grip, the terrible patience of a man who knows that to grab is to lose and that he must instead coax, must offer the back of one freezing finger and wait, in a running current, for a dying animal to choose to trust it. His lips moved. I was close enough to catch it barely, under the rush of the water, he was talking to it. The man who had not spoken a word on his post in 2 hours was murmuring down into a storm drain, a steady low stream of nothing words, the sounds you make to a frightened thing. Easy now. Easy, I have you. Come on, that's it, come to me, the oldest language there is. And the kitten, with the very last of itself, came to him. I saw his whole body change, saw the search go still and then close, saw his shoulder drop another inch as he turned his trapped arm in the bars to bring his cupped hand up flat under the small weight, slow, so slow, against the pull of the water that wanted it. The captain's hand tightened on his shoulder. Easy, the captain breathed. You have it. Bring it home. He drew his arm up out of the drain. It came up slowly, the wet sleeve red dark, and then his cupped hand cleared the iron, and in it was the smallest, sorriest scrap of a living thing I have ever seen. Gray, soaked to nothing, no bigger than the man's palm, its tiny mouth open and no sound coming out of it, its eyes shut, its whole body a single shiver. For one awful second I thought he had brought up a dead thing, and so did he. I saw the dread cross his face, and then the kitten's chest moved, the barest flutter, and the young man let out a breath that seemed to empty him from the boots up. The crowd did not cheer. That is the thing I always tell people who ask. You would expect a cheer, 500 people and the small life saved, and there was none, not yet, because the thing was so nearly gone that a cheer would have felt like tempting it. Instead, there was a sound like a whole crowd sighing at once, and then absolute, reverent quiet, as if we had all walked without meaning to into a church. He did not stand. He sat back on his heels there on the wet cobbles with the kitten in his two cupped hands, and he bent over it, and he began, very gently, to warm it. He breathed on it. He rubbed one wet thumb along its soaked spine, slow, the way you would dry an infant, the way somebody must once have shown him, because no man invents that gentleness on a forecourt under 500 eyes. The kitten was too cold and too far gone to right itself, its head lolling against his fingers, and he tucked it in against the warmth of his own throat, just under the brass-buttoned collar of the scarlet tunic, and held it there with one big hand cradled over it like a roof, and bent his head down over his hands and waited. "Come on," I heard him say, almost nothing. "Come on, little soldier, you held the line. Don't quit on me now." I do not know why those words undid me, but they did, and I was not the only one. A man cannot stand at the West Forecourt corner for 19 years and weep easily, and I wept. The woman beside me had given up trying to cover her face. The father with the boy on his shoulders had his hand pressed flat over his own mouth. And the captain, Captain Vance, who had a procession stacked up behind the inner gate, and a regulation broken across his knee, and every reason in the world to be furious. The captain knelt there beside his sentry in the wet, and watched the boy warm a kitten against his throat, and did not say one word about the post. The kitten began to cry again. It was a thread of a cry, the same thin, ragged noise that had started the whole thing, but coming the other way now, coming back up out of nearly gone, the small machine of it catching and turning over, and at the sound of it, the young man's shoulders dropped and his whole hard face cracked into the most ordinary, helpless, beautiful smile I have ever seen on a soldier, and that was when the forecourt finally let go. It came up like weather. It started somewhere down the rope line and ran the length of it and crossed the apron and went up the front of the palace and came back, 500 people clapping and calling out, the sound rolling around that stone square the way the carriage wheels were meant to and never did. Strangers gripped each other's arms. The small child on the father's shoulders was shouting the cat's alive at the top of its lungs and laughing. People I had sold flowers to that very morning were turned to each other with shining faces saying, "Did you see? Did you see what he did?" And the young man knelt in the middle of all of it with a half-drowned kitten crying against his collar and went scarlet to the ears, because he had no idea, none, what to do with 500 people loving him, having never in his service been looked at as anything but furniture with a rifle. He had been a statue. We had made him a statue. We pay these men to be statues, to stand so still that we can take our photograph beside the discipline of them and go home. And in 3 strides he had walked off the only thing we knew him to be and become, in front of all of us, a young man on his knees on a wet drain, with his hat off and his gloves gone, and his arm soaked to the shoulder, breathing life back into something the size of his thumb. And we discovered all together in one held morning that there had been a person inside the statue the whole time, that there is always a person inside the statue. We had simply never given one of them a reason to show us. That is the thing I carried away and have never set down, not that he saved a kitten. That a man can stand so still for so long that you forget he is a man, and that the stillness is not the absence of a heart but a heart held under terrible discipline, and that the day something small enough and helpless enough cries out at his feet, the discipline that held him will be the same strength that breaks him loose to save it. The stillness was never coldness. The stillness was a man keeping faith with his orders so completely that the only thing that could ever move him was something that could not save itself. But I am getting ahead of the morning, because the morning was not finished, and the best of it was still to come. A steward came running with a folded horse blanket from the mews, and the young man wrapped the kitten in it, all but the wet gray face, and the captain stood and helped his sentry to his feet. And for a moment the two of them stood there, the officer in his good uniform with his knees soaked through, the sentry with his bearskin still lying on the cobbles and the small bundle held against his chest, and looked at each other. I was close enough to hear it. "You broke your post, Corporal," the captain said. "Yes, sir," the young man said, "I did. On the morning of a procession. In front of the whole forecourt." "Yes, sir." The captain looked at the kitten and looked at the crowd and looked back at the boy, and what he said then I have repeated at my supper table more times than my wife can bear. "Then you had better have a very good reason in your report," Captain Vance said, "and I should think it was alive and I could feel it, and I was the only one whose arm would reach will do. Pick up your bearskin, son. We'll talk about your post when the small thing is breathing on its own." He bent and picked up the bearskin himself, the captain did, and the white gloves and the rifle, and held them while the young man kept both hands on the kitten, and the two of them walked off the apron together toward the guardroom under the arch. And the crowd parted for them, the way crowds part for something they know they will tell their grandchildren about, clapping all the way, reaching out just to touch the corporal's sleeve as he passed. I thought that was the end of it. A good story, a kind man, a saved life, enough to keep a flower seller talking for a year. I gathered up my buckets and I was wrong again, because the morning had one more thing in it, and it is the thing that makes me tell the whole of it instead of just the pretty middle. The procession had to come through. That is the part people forget when they hear the soft version of the story. A household does not stop the world for a kitten. The carriages were stacked at the inner gate. The timing was wrecked. There were people of consequence in those carriages with places to be, and now the mews post, the visible edge of the working thing, stood empty, its sentry gone under the arch with a horse blanket bundle against his chest. The forecourt was still warm with what it had just watched, but warmth does not run a procession, and I saw the stewards' faces tight as the machinery of the morning tried to start itself again around the hole the corporal had left. A second guard came out at the quick march to take the mews post. We all watched him come, a leaner man, older, sergeant's chevrons, his face shut as a vault, and a little of the warmth went out of the square, because here was the discipline coming back, here was the statue restored, and the part of all of us that had just fallen in love with a young man on his knees felt the morning closing back over the wound it had opened. The sergeant reached the empty mark on the cobbles. He halted. He brought his rifle up to the shoulder and his eyes to the front, and he became, in 2 seconds, the thing the corporal had stopped being. The fixed point, the still man, the edge of the working thing. The carriages would roll now. The world had its statue back. And then the sergeant, with his eyes locked to the front and his face like a vault, said one thing, quietly, meant for no one and heard by the whole front rank. "Is it breathing?" He did not turn his head. He did not move. He had been on the post for 10 seconds and he was perfect, and he asked it the way a man asks a thing he must know and will not break his post to find out, straight ahead, into the middle distance, to whoever in the crowd could see under the arch where the corporal had gone. And a woman at the rope line who could see called back to him soft, "He's warming it, soldier, it's crying, it's going to live." And the sergeant said, "Good," to the middle distance and stood his post, and I understood then that the warmth had not gone anywhere. It had only put its bearskin back on. The same heart was under this one. The same heart is under all of them. They just take turns being the one who is allowed to show it. The carriages came through. They came through the way they always do, the matched grays, the gleaming lacquer, the wheels loud on the cobbles, the small important faces behind the glass, and the crowd cheered them, because that is what the crowd is there to do. But I will tell you the truth. Nobody was looking at the carriages. Half the forecourt had its eyes on the arch where the corporal had gone, and the other half kept glancing at the storm drain, the ordinary iron grate at the lip of the carriage road that nobody had ever once looked at in their lives, and that none of us would ever walk past again without remembering. The procession was the thing the morning was supposed to be about. The drain was the thing it would be remembered for. That happens more than the people who plan processions like to think. I sold out of flowers in 20 minutes. People wanted to buy something, anything. They wanted to have done something with the feeling in their chests, and a posy was the nearest thing to hand. A man bought my whole last bucket and walked it over to the rope line nearest the arch and stood there holding 40 stems of cheap spring flowers, not knowing what to do with them, until a steward took pity and said he would see them got to the guardroom, for the corporal and the cat. I have thought about that too, that we will pour out our love so readily once we are given a shape to pour it into, and that a young man's bare arm down a storm drain had given 500 strangers a shape, and that we had been walking around all morning, all our lives, full of love with nowhere to put it, until he showed us where. But here is what I learned later in the weeks after, the part of the story that lives under the part you can see. Because a flower seller hears everything, eventually, standing on the same corner long enough. The corporal's name was Owen Tam. He was 24. He was 3 weeks short of the end of his service. He had given his years and he was going home to a village in the hill country where his mother kept a small holding, and he had planned. He told the guardroom that afternoon to finish quiet, to stand his last watches without a mark on him good or bad, to walk out of Harrowmere the way 9 men in 10 walk out, unremembered, a clean record and a folded uniform and a long road home. He had not wanted to be the guard who broke his post. No man who has held that discipline for years wants the thing he is remembered for to be the morning he failed to hold it. And there is a reason he could not hold it, and I did not learn it until the village newspaper from his hill country found its way to a tourist who showed it to me on her telephone, weeks on, because the small story had traveled further than anyone meant it to. When Owen Tam was 9 years old, his father went out in a winter flood to bring the smallholdings animals up out of a low field, and the water came faster than a man can run, and his father got the animals out and did not get himself out. They found him 3 days down the valley. Owen Tam had grown up the son of a man who drowned saving things that could not save themselves, in cold, rushing water, because he was the only one whose arm would reach. I am not telling you that to make you weep, though it made me weep. I am telling you because it is the whole answer to the question every person in that forecourt was secretly asking, the question that hangs over every one of these stories. Why him? Why that morning? Why did the statue break for the smallest thing in the square when it had held against gales and mockery and grief? Because the smallest thing in the square was a living creature, half drowned, crying in cold, running water, with only one arm in the world long enough to reach it, and the man on the mews post had spent his whole life knowing exactly, to the inch, what it costs when the arm that should have reached does not, and what it is worth when it does. He did not break his post in spite of his discipline. The same thing that built the discipline built the breaking. A man learns to stand utterly still so that, on the one morning it matters, he will move faster and surer and braver than anyone else in the square. That is what the stillness was for. We just never knew, because we had never seen the morning it was for. That is why I cannot tell the short version. The short version is a kitten and a kind soldier and a crowd that cheered. The long version is a boy who lost his father to cold water and grew into a man who stood like a statue on a stone square until the day cold water cried out at his feet, and then became, for 90 seconds, the thing his father had been, and brought the small life up where his father could not bring himself. The long version is why the stillness was never the opposite of love. The long version is the only true one. But the morning still had an end, a real one, and it came that afternoon under the arch, where I would not have seen it if a steward I have sold flowers to for years had not come and fetched me, because he said the corporal had asked. I went under the arch into the cool of the gatehouse, where I had never once been in 19 years on the corner, and there was the guardroom, and there was Owen Tam, out of the wet tunic now and in his shirt sleeves, sitting on a bench by the small iron stove with the kitten in his lap. It had been dried and fed warm milk from the corner of a cloth, and it was a different creature, still tiny, still unsteady, but dry now and gray-blue and faintly outraged, the way the very young are once the danger is past and they have decided to be insulted instead. It was kneading at the wool of his trousers with paws no bigger than peas. It was going to live. You could see it in the indignation of it. Things that are dying do not bother to be indignant. I wanted you to see it dry, the corporal said to me, shy as a boy. You set your flowers down, I saw you. You were the first one who heard it too. And I understood that he had marked me from the post, in the half-second before he broke it, the one other person in the square who had stopped looking at the gates, and that it had mattered to him, in some way, not to be the only one, and that he wanted to give me the end of the story because I had been there for the start of it. I have been thanked for many things in my life. I have never been thanked for setting down a bucket. Captain Vance was there too, by the door. The report had been written. I will tell you what was in it, because the corporal told me himself, and because it is the cleanest thing I know about how an honorable institution handles an honorable man who breaks its rules. The report said that Corporal Owen Tam had left the Mews post without relief during the assembly for a state procession. That was the charge, and it was true, and the regulation for it is not gentle. And then, under it, in the captain's own hand, the report said that the corporal had done so to remove a drowning animal from a storm drain on the carriage road, that he had returned to no harm to the procession owing to the inner gate hold, that the act had been witnessed by the assembled public and reflected, in the captain's judgment, the conduct of a soldier and not the failure of one, and that the captain accordingly recommended no charge, but a note on the file, to record that the post was broken, and to record why, so that any man reading it hereafter may know that the two things can be true at once. So that the two things can be true at once. He broke the rule and he did right, and the institution was strong enough and honest enough to write both down and not pretend either away. I have thought since that you can measure the worth of any house, a regiment, a family, a kingdom, by whether it can hold those two truths in one hand without dropping one. Harrowmere held them. The captain held them. That is the honor in the story that is easy to miss for looking at the kitten. Owen Tam did not go home unremembered after all. He finished his 3 weeks. And on his last morning, when he stood his last watch on the Mews post and the relief came to take it from him and the changing was done, the whole guardroom came out under the arch, the captain, the leaner sergeant who had asked, "Is it breathing?" without turning his head, the whole off-duty watch, and they did not give him a medal, because there is no medal for what he did and he would not have taken it. They gave him the kitten. It had stayed in the guardroom the whole 3 weeks. Of course it had. Where else does a half-drowned thing go but to the men who pulled it out of the water? It had grown into a lean gray half-grown cat with a white bib and a torn ear and an absolute contempt for the rifle drill, and it had become, without anyone deciding it, the thing the watch came back to at the end of a cold post, the small warm life on the guardroom stove, the reason a hard man's face went soft when the door shut behind him. They had been going to keep it. It would have made a fine mascot. Regiments have kept stranger. But on his last morning they put it in his arms instead, in a wicker carrier with the regiment's blanket folded under it, and the captain said, "It came out of the ground on your arm, corporal. It goes home on it. Take the little soldier with you." And Owen Tam, who had stood like stone through gales and grief and the laughter of strangers, stood under the arch with a cat in a basket and could not get a single word out, and did not have to, because every man there knew exactly what he could not say. He took it home to the hill country, to the small holding, to the low field, to the cold valley where the water had taken his father. I had this last part from his mother's own letter, which the steward read me on the corner one spring morning a year on, because the corporal had written to ask that I be told how it ended, the man not forgetting the flower seller who set down her bucket. The cat lived 9 years. It hunted the barn and slept on the hearth and followed Owen Tam out to the animals every cold morning of those 9 years, down to the low field by the water, and waited on the bank while he worked, and walked back up with him every single time. A gray cat by a flood field, where a boy once lost the man who went in for the things that could not save themselves. And the man that boy became had reached down into cold water in front of 500 strangers and brought one small life back up, and it had walked beside him, up out of the low field, safe, every morning for 9 years, as if to keep proving to him that sometimes the arm does reach in time, and the cold water gives the small thing back. I am only a flower seller. I have stood on the same corner for 20 years now, and I will stand there until my knees give out, and I have watched 1,000 sentries stand 1,000 watches, and the tourists still pay me 3 coins for a posy, because they have just seen a man stand so still they cannot believe he is alive. I let them believe it. But I know better now, and on the bright hard mornings when the cobbles are dark with the night's rain, I look at the iron grate at the lip of the carriage road, and I look at the still young man on the mews post, and I know what is under the stillness, and I know what it is for. It is the smallest thing he will ever break his post for, and the largest. It is the whole of him, held in reserve. Against the morning something cries out at his feet with no other arm in the world to reach it. And when that morning comes he will move. They always do. That is the thing the stillness was hiding all along.